Hello fellow solvers, this is Cog with Cog Analytics, jumping back into the Alteryx Designer desktop discussions to take a look at an interesting problem covering iterative macros. So our question here is share matching analysis, first in, first out, iterative macro needed, shared by unhashable, and to answer off, kind of spoil the ending, yes, an iterative macro is absolutely recommended for a problem like this. Before we dive into the actual problem itself though, I wanted to say this question is phenomenally written, very well put together, very detailed in terms of its problem description, the steps that have been taken that need to be taken to generate the output from the input, the fields, what they mean, as well as approaches that have been tried. In general, images are not recommended, but these are very tastefully done, very legible, very well put together, and an Excel spreadsheet with the tabular versions of these screenshots has been attached as well, including an Alteryx workflow that showcases what's already been attempted. So this is, again, fantastic question. Let's dive in. So framing this problem, what we have as input is a vertical table with purchase and sale information for share transactions by customer ID, share ID for a given date, capturing the units traded. What we need to do is we need to find a way or develop a way to associate purchases and sales, basically a join. On the left side we have purchases, the right we have sales, such that we can associate sale orders to their respective purchases. So we know what shares we're selling. And then we can calculate this new column, the holding period. So we'll go ahead and jump into to illustrate the problem better. We can see in the input we have a cluster of data, a nice grouping here, again, color-coded, very helpful for customer ID and share ID. So we have purchases and sales that are all related to each other. And one of the first things that jumps out at me, and you should notice, is that we have sale orders like the 17 shares that only partially cover a purchase. So it would take multiple sales in order to completely cover a single purchase order. On the other hand, we have sale orders like this 856 shares that cover multiple purchases. And so what we see is we have a many-to-many relationship between these two entities. Now, ordinarily, that can make things more complicated in terms of thinking through how exactly are we going to iterate on this, how are we going to relate these two. But one of the kind of underlying logical relationships that exist in this case is that you can only sell shares that you have already purchased. So if you don't own the shares, you can't sell them. And so we see ultimately here that purchases are the foundational aspect of this problem. And that informed me as to how I was going to approach solving this problem. And that includes taking a single sale record at a time. So in an iteration, we'll take one sale record and we will apply it to all the purchases that we can in that iteration until that sale is completely used up and we've covered all the shares available to us. Then and only then do we move on to the next sale record in the next iteration. And we do that until we've gone through all sales and covered all purchases available to us. One of the other things to note is that we have in the desired output two columns. So this is the purchasing side, this is the sales side, again, two columns of data tracking the share counts. So in order to do this, there are two ways to do that. One, we can either do joins and try and bring that information back in so that we can keep track of these original share counts and the transactional share counts record by record. Or one of the things that I like to do is jump into Alteryx. So we have our input tool here, which is just the input data from the Excel spreadsheet that was attached. You can immediately throw on a formula tool, and we're going to add a new column of data. And this is going to be a duplicate of the units traded. Make sure we set our type. And that's it. So we need two columns in our output, and here we have two columns in our input that we can use to track share counts in both ways, keeping track of the original data as well as keeping track of transactional data record by record, what's going on. And so this is all we need. We can go ahead and copy this in order to jump into our macro and begin building out our iterative macro. So we'll throw in a macro input tool. Actually, we won't do that. I'll paste in the data that I just copied and convert that to macro input tool. Perfect. I like to put the annotation on the left. And one of the first things I like to do in building iterative macros is I will rename my iteration input to iterate. And that way when I'm setting up the actual kind of musculature settings of this macro, it's a lot easier for me to find which tools I'm working with and to know what's what. The other thing that I like to do is to bring out two macro outputs. There generally will be two that you're working with for iterative macros. The first one I like to call complete, and I'll give that the anchor abbreviation C. And then the other one I will label iterate, and this is what is going to pass data back to the macro input tool every iteration. And I leave that blank so that users know there's no useful data coming out of it. So move those off to the side and begin building out the workflow. So one of the first things we want to do is filter off. Remember, we have purchase and sale data together, and we want all purchases, and then we're only going to pull a single sale record by a given customer and share ID. Take a look at that. We have all our purchases that we're going to be able to track, and we have all our sales. So we're going to immediately sort this list by date. So we get the first in, first out behavior that was described. Always make sure you're sorting, especially with AMP engine. And then we're going to go ahead and sample off the first single record by customer and by share ID. And now we have all of our data. So we have a single sale record for each customer and share ID, and we have all of our purchase data. We can now join this together and begin building our final output. So we'll join on customer ID and share ID. Now we'll go ahead and clean this up, adding in the relevant fields, renaming things. So this is our sell date, customer, share ID, transaction type we do not need. This is units purchased. This is units carried forward. This is purchase date. And this is sell date. We don't need duplicate information, and we don't need transaction type here. This is units sold. This is actual units sold. Okay, and that's that. So if we run this, we see that the J output anchor of the join tool is beginning to take the form that we need for the desired output. So we have our left side with purchase information, our right side with sale information. Now we're ready to start doing the actual grunt work to put together and do the calculation of assigning these sales to purchases. You can immediately see that this is not where we need it to be because we have a duplication here of the 17 shares we're trying to apply, but we're currently applying it to both the 540 and the 333. So that's what we're going to fix next. Of course, before we can do that, we're going to want to sort the data again, this time just on purchase date, since we only have one sale for every grouping. So we'll sort there. And actually, for the sake of legibility, I will sort on customer and share ID as well, just so that we can see the data more cleanly. And because we're trying to apply a formula to multiple records to keep track of how something behaves across a group, we will use the multi-row formula tool. Now we don't need to create a new field, we're going to update an existing field, which is actual units sold. And one of the things I like to do if the problem allows it is to change this from 0 or empty to null. Because there's no case where actual units sold is going to be null, I can use this to identify where I'm at in the process. So I can find when I'm on the first record. Of course, we're going to group by customer and share ID, and now I'm going to utilize that null by immediately checking if the previous record for actual units sold is null, then I know I'm currently looking at the very first record in the data set for a given group. I don't want to do anything. Whatever the actual units sold is, that is going to be how many shares I have left to sell at timestamp 0. Basically my starting point. Otherwise, this is where we get to do our calculation. We have the maximum of 0, or we're going to look backwards one row to say, what are we trying to sell? What do we have left to sell? And how many shares were covered by that sale? And so we have units carried forward. And that is all we need in order to accomplish this section of the code. And I will explain kind of what this multi-row formula tool is doing in a second. We can see here, though, this makes sense. We have 5,000 shares to sell, covered by 5,000 purchase, 1,000, 1,000. Our 17 is going to be covered the 540, which leaves nothing left to cover for the 333 because there's more shares that we've purchased than we're selling at this point in time for this iteration. So this looks great. This is exactly what we're looking for. Now we can go ahead and start cleaning up our remaining fields. So we'll throw on a formula tool. We need to update actual units sold because that was not calculated here. What this calculated is the remaining shares to sell. Now we need to convert that to what we're actually selling for each record, and that is just the minimum of actual units sold and the units carried forward. There we go. We'll add on to this our new columns, which are units to carry forward. Make sure I set the data type. And the units to carry forward is just what's left. So this is going to be the units carried forward minus how many we're selling in this particular iteration, so actual units sold. And then last but not least, we have our holding period, our new column. Make sure to set this as well. And the datetime diff function is what's going to be our friend here. So datetime diff, for anybody that's ever been confused, the parameters for this function, it's date 1, so in this case it's sell date, minus date 2, and then the units that you're doing the difference on. So in this case, day. You can write days as well. Both of them are the same, which is really nice. So datetime diff plus 1 to account for the starting date, and that gives us 794 days between our first record in the data set as our sample. And that is all we need to add there. We're getting ready to actually output to our complete macro output tool. Go ahead and run that just to see and showcase where we're at. So we have our purchase information on the left, we have our sell information on the right, we have these new columns tracking what we're carrying forward. We can see the 523 looks good, and then our holding period for each of those records. Now, we have two things we need to do before we're actually ready to output. The first thing is we can see here that actual units sold is 0 for this record. And that's not useful information to output because it means that we haven't done anything in this iteration. So I don't need to showcase that. We don't need to output that. So we'll immediately throw on a filter tool and just get rid of that. So we only want to keep records where actual units sold is greater than 0. The other thing we need to pay attention to and notice is that the units carried forward here, this was really useful to us for doing the calculations and building out, getting to where we're at. But for the purpose of the output, this column is historical information. And in the first iteration, this should be 0. We don't have any historical information. There were no previous shares purchased that we're still keeping track of. So we will go ahead and just drop that now. So units carried forward, and we can check here. We need to be mindful. Obviously, we can't just set it to 0 because we need to think of future iterations, and this will come into play later. So we can't just 0 it out. So units carried forward, if they equal units purchased, then set it to 0. Otherwise, just leave it as what it is. So keep the historical information unless we're in this first case. In that first case, we preset this to be the same, so we can use that as our check. Okay. So if we run this one final time, we should see that everything now looks good to go. We have only 4 records. All of those records have sales associated with them. We have no historical information for this first iteration, and we have the holding period being calculated as well. So this is perfect. This is exactly what we're looking for. I'm going to go ahead and go into this and just clean up the annotations. So that's a little bit easier. We'll say formatting. Give us some space to work with. Okay, so now we're ready to build out the iteration output. Now, whenever you're doing an iterative macro, this iteration output needs to be exactly the same format as the iteration input. And that way we know that we have a clean handshake back and forth between the two, so our loop is going to work. Okay, So in order to do that, we need to add back in a field that we dropped off, which is that transaction type. So we'll go ahead and add a new column, transaction type. This is purchase. We can say purchase because, remember, we're keeping track every iteration of all purchases, and we're only applying a single sale to those purchases. So every record here is fundamentally a purchase record. So this is safe to do here. Be careful in general because you, depending on your problem or use case, may not be able to do just that. But here it's okay. And now we can throw on a select tool. We're going to rename our fields so that they match the input, as well as reorganize. So we have our date, customer ID, share ID, units purchased should be units traded. Now units carried forward, we need the remaining column, but this is not, this is the historical version for this iteration, so we don't want this one. We don't need any sale information, but the units to carry forward is what's informing us of the next iteration, so this is what's going to be our remaining. And then the holding period, we do not need transaction type, we just added, and that will go up here. And that should now match exactly what we had from the input, date, IDs, transaction type, units traded, and remaining. Perfect. Okay, so I'll go ahead and run that, see what we have here. And there you go. So we're getting the format, but what we can see here is we have some remaining records with zeros. And this means that we have covered all of the shares associated with this purchase already. Now, that's great, but we don't want to carry this through the next iteration because that will just muck up what we've already done, and in some cases can end up causing errors. I don't think it should in this case, but it's good practice to remove off anything you don't want to send back through the loop. So we only want to keep records where remaining is greater than 0. Beautiful. So this should be all our purchase information. We'll run that here in a second, but before we do that, we can grab a union tool, drop that here, down. We need to bring in our sale information from over here. So this is the first record where we're pulling off only the most recent sale that we're looking at, or really the earliest sale that we're looking at. We can copy and paste that sample tool. And now instead of getting the first, we want to skip the first so we can look at everything else. And this is what we're going to drag, connect to the union tool, and be prepared for our iteration. And there you go. So now we have 4 records coming out, our remaining purchases, and then the 1 sale record that we haven't actually addressed yet, ready for the second iteration. And one of the things that can be beneficial to do is to take what's going into your output. We'll select all of these records with headers, swing back to our input, and basically iterate the macro manually. So we'll delete everything here, paste in our data set, since it's small enough to do without causing problems for us. And now we can run this, and we'll look at what iteration 2 ought to look like. And so we'll jump into the multi-row formula tool just to see what I was describing before, how we're not calculating the actual units sold here as the output to this tool. Instead, what we're tracking is how many shares we have left to sell or to cover. So to begin with, we have 856 for this record. It's covering 523. So for the next record, what it's looking back at is 856 minus 523. We have 333 shares left. And you can imagine if we had a bunch more records, it helps to have that information moving down, being inherited from record to record. Because if we only calculated this out and this was 523, now we're lost as to where we're at in the process and what we had to begin with. So, very helpful way of doing things and very necessary in this particular problem. Everything else should be built out exactly as we've already expected, as we've seen. We can check our final output here. We have our share ID, purchase information. Alrighty. It's carried forward. Okay. There we go. I'm thinking there's an issue here. So we have units purchased, units carried forward. This should be 0 now. That's because we are not moving this forward. So that is one of the things we need to do is set this to, if they're equal, set it to 0. Otherwise, set it to, I believe this should be not units carried forward, but units. No, yeah, that's correct actually. So yes, units carried forward. This is what historically we had, and this is what we have moving forward. So there's no information to carry forward any further. If we check our iteration output, we have nothing here. This is perfect. Okay, I'm getting myself worked up over nothing. So there we go. This right here is the entirety of our macro. So we have our iteration input, everything in between, we have an output, and we have the iteration output. Now we can go ahead and set this, go to workflow, make sure this is set as an iterative macro. And in view, interface designer, we can edit this, and here we go. So this is where the naming comes into play. So our iteration input, if we select this dropdown, we can always know we're going to select iterate, and the output, iterate, because ahead of time we built this out exactly how we wanted it. I don't know how many records the original poster is dealing with. I usually like to set this high for cases where this is going to run pretty fast, just so that we don't have to deal with this later. There we go. And everything else should be okay in this case. So we'll go ahead and hide this, save the macro, jump back into our workflow. We can insert our sample macro now, throw in a sort tool so that everything looks the way that we expect it to. So we'll sort on customer ID, share ID, purchase date, and then sell date. Add a browse tool. And if everything was done correctly, which it should have been, we should now have our output. There you go. So we have purchase information, we have a cluster for customer ID, share ID, we have units purchased, totals, we have units carried forward, historical transactional information, then we have our share or the sell information covering the units sold, how many actually sold, what we carried forward, and the holding period calculated for all of them. So hope this was informative for you guys. I really like putting together iterative macros. It's a lot of fun, kind of pushing the boundaries. It's a great thought experiment trying to put together and think through how you're going to approach these problems before you start building out the workflows. That is 75%, maybe even 80% of the workload in terms of building an iterative macro is coming up with the game plan before you start putting tools on the canvas. So, like I said, very interesting problem, good use case for iterative macros. Hope this helps you guys. Happy solving.